Welcome to the Agent of Wealth podcast with Mark Bautis from Bautis Financial. In this podcast, Mark helps guide you towards financial freedom, ensure you never run out of money, and create a balance in life that prioritizes what is most important to you. Join us for this journey as Mark draws from years of expertise and guest experts to solve the multiple wealth building challenges involved in your financial life.
Welcome back to the Agent of Wealth podcast. This is your co-host, John Williams, and today I'm joined by a special guest, Eugene Theodore. Eugene is a strategist, a former photojournalist, and the author of Built to Collapse. Eugene works at the intersection of power, profit, and people, helping leaders understand why modern systems often succeed in ways that make collapse inevitable. Drawing on firsthand experience inside boardrooms, venture-backed startups, NGOs, global institutions, his work explores the hidden costs of growth at all costs and the erosion of trust, meaning, and human judgment. Eugene, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, we're excited to dive into this. This is a great topic. I think it runs across really almost every person who's involved in business and really just everyday life, if you really think about it. And before we get started, I thought it'd be nice to give our listeners a little bit of a background and what led you to focus on systems, incentives, and long-term sustainability.
Sure. So it's a bit atypical, but as I say, I'll give you the quick New York 1-minute intro. I actually started off as a photojournalist. I was one of the few people in downtown Manhattan on September 11th with a camera. So that launched me very directly into seeing things firsthand and then tracking how they evolved from there. Several steps after that, I fell into the corporate world. So working for several CPG companies, producing everything from household goods to cars. And then when I decided to go back to my, let's say, more creative photojournalistic roots, that corporate and financial element sort of followed with me. And as I started getting creative briefs from clients, I realized that the foundations that we were working off of weren't there, or they were missing, or they were just plain wrong. So to answer your first question, that was kind of the impetus and the initial foresight of, okay, if something isn't working, is it a symptom? Or is it a symptom, of that very specific request? Or is it a symptom of something that is much more systematic? And over the last 10 to 15 years, if I was to sort of balance, is it a micro symptom or a systematic system? By and large, the problems that not just businesses have, but various areas of human development have, they are system based. It's kind of the first principle that you can always reduce everything to. So that's how I got here.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. The idea that everyone talks about hard work and grit, and obviously that's a big part of success, but I often, and I can't even give somebody credit, but I hear people say, and I've heard people say about how I'll take a really great system against a really good hard worker any day, and like the importance of that, and making sure that if you're working hard, you're working on the right things. Obviously seems to make a lot of sense. Just as a side note, we could probably have an entire podcast on your experience on September 11th. I'm sure that was everybody. It's like one of those events in people's lives that are old enough to remember. They remember exactly where they were when they started, you heard about that, or that, just that whole experience. I'm sure that was intense.
Well, I mean, the previous moment of collective global human consciousness was the JFK assassination, right? So for those people who are alive at that point, they remember where they were at that point. I don't know what the next generation's, human consciousness moment will be. I'm a little bit fearful of what it might be, but for the moment, let's hope it doesn't come, or at least it's nothing as violent.
I share the same sentiment, and I totally agree. Like, growing up, people said, "Hey, I was sitting in my classroom, and the teacher brought in the TV when JFK was assassinated," and it really is. And I tend to agree with you that if it's usually not something good, right? When something like that happens, and we remember it. Your experience across Fortune 500 companies, venture-backed startups, global organizations. I'm curious if you can identify and tell us consistent patterns that kept showing up.
Of course. So anyone exposed to, let's say, innovation, product innovation, service innovation, just having to invent something new, they've probably come across the very belabored quote, right, that over 90% of new things fail, right? The reason that these things fail isn't because they aren't well researched or they aren't well marketed or well funded or any of that. It really comes down to one overall reason, which is a systematic reason, which is they didn't have a right to exist in the first place. The reason they didn't have a right to exist in the first place is because either by launching it, you're cannibalizing your existing business or portfolio, you're actively competing with it. It's something that you don't really have a right to launch to begin with. It's one step too far. But the system that promotes innovation is always one of, to go back to your point about, tough work and grit. It's, let's do as much as we can, do it as quickly as we can, throw the spaghetti on the wall, see what sticks. If something sticks, then we'll iterate and we'll make it better. But it's that constant forward looking attitude, which is driven by the overall system of, we need to grow, we need to make profit, or we need to find profit, we need to advance. There has to be this constant forward motion. We're not happy just sort of treading water and sitting still. And that goes for $100 billion businesses. If you talk to $100 billion businesses and they're bored and say, aren't you just happy maintaining yourselves at that $100 billion level? They'll say stagnation is death. So we always have to grow. And always have to grow means we have to be increasingly creative, but creative through very certain lenses to try and bring that growth. And usually the lenses, they're restricted, because either you have to be profitable, or you have to find what are called auxiliary or ancillary services or products, which somehow are supposed to be competitive or somehow are supposed to increase your share of the basket or share of the portfolio. And if those are the only metrics that are being used, then the result of that is, again, either that cannibalization, that kind of internal competition. And then all of that filters down, not just from an innovation point of view, but it impacts all the functions in the company. So I'll give you another example. Again, let's take this $100 billion not so fictitious company. If you have 50,000 employees and at the end of the year, they need to be evaluated, right? For promotion, for salary increases, right? Because everyone is supposed to be constantly growing and improving. And you tell them, you have to show me the one thing you did on the business that fundamentally changed the business. And in that $100 billion company, just for the sake of argument, let's say you just have one product. Imagine 50,000 people trying to pull that one product in 50,000 directions, because each one of them, according to the system that's been given to them, are told either you do something significant or you don't count. You don't get promoted. You don't get the salary increase. We don't value anymore. We fire you. That one product is not going to survive for very long. And that's where you get, I'll quote some very spectacular crashes. You might remember the Tropicana packaging change issue, right? Where we went from the very, 30 years of untouched, amazing Tropicana brand to, a carton that you had no idea what it was selling. That was the result of this kind of system incentivized process. Someone had to change something. This was the change. They pushed it. They got it. And for the short-term impact, they got the tick box. They probably even got promoted. But the long-term effect on the business and the system that they were supposed to be serving obviously wasn't there.
That's really interesting. I mean, the energy of 50,000 people, and this probably happens a lot, that they're being sent out, and most of those people, there's a bell curve there, but want to be successful, and they're working really, really hard, and they can be pulling the company in a completely wrong direction because, those incentives are just not in line with what could potentially be a long-term success. Not using necessarily the name of companies, but do you have any examples of like what something like that looks like removing inefficiencies, that were actually protecting some of these things that were actually like harming the company?
So since AI is a big topic, I'll revert everyone's attention to your basic average AI chatbot, right? Now you can't interact with a company almost anymore unless there's at least some kind of, I call it interfering, but an AI chatbot interface. It used to be just a simple Q&A chatbot. You could always bypass it and say, give me the human support or the live agent, or put me in touch with a human. Now, most of the time, you can't even get to that level. You just get stuck in these infinity loops. Companies have looked at AI specifically within the customer service area to say, listen, in the US 50 years ago, we had American-based customer service centers, call centers. Then they went offshore. They went to India. They went to wherever they went to. And then AI came on the scene a few years ago, and they said, you know what? We don't even need these humans, even if they are 500,000 miles away. AI and chatbots can replace all of that. It's much more efficient. Obviously, we can process more requests, deal with more requests. probably get through the bulk of, support tickets and whatever in a quote unquote more efficient manner. The issue is that by systemically defaulting to, again, chatbots, which for the most part have not necessarily been developed in house, right? So, because no company has that AI expertise, or within the AI family of expertise is the sub function of AI chatbots, customer service chatbots, technical service chatbots. Like each one of these is its own niche and has its own academic rigor that's needed. So they've most inevitably outsourced this to some agency that has done it for them. The agency has given them, again, they have their own systems. They say, here, fill in this 10-page questionnaire. And based off of this very myopic and very limited point of view that we're allowing you to share with us, we will create your custom AI tech support chatbot. Anyway, if you take all this in mass and you multiply it, even just, we'll stick to this $100 billion fictional company. They have their chatbot for tech support, their chatbot for customer service, their chatbot for missed deliveries, whatever, for logistics. And this is how they've been built, because their system said, outsource it to an agency. It's cheaper than developing it out in-house. The agency had its own system saying it's cheaper to sort of try and funnel everyone through these 10 pages of questions and not actually get into the real grit and the real understanding of what this company is and how they function. You then end up with a cohesion of these systems which were never compatible to begin with. And the end result is that you and me, as a customer, a consumer, a user of whatever product or service this is, you get stuck in these systems where you can't solve your problem. You can't get in touch with a real human who could hopefully solve the problem. And in the end, again, looking at it from beyond the single interaction, but from the long-term point of view, as a customer, as a consumer, you will probably stop buying from that company, stop spending money at that company. And at some point, you might actually get quite angry and start giving it bad reviews, bad mouthing it, not recommending it to your friends anymore, or going to the other side and telling people actively not to use it. So all of these are ripple effects, which, yes, if you take the one angry review on trustedpilot.com, you say, okay, that was just one hack who was extremely pissed off with his late delivery. But these things compound. And the thing is that the current systems don't, seem to ignore that entire side world that they're creating. And they also don't even seem to take into account that as they try and interact with each other, their systems they just don't iterate with each other. They just don't properly interact with each other.
Glad you use that example, because it's in our face every day right now. And there's things about it that certainly worry me. I mean, I think that part of the problem is and one of my favorite sayings of all time, really, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And now there's this pressure because there's such capital being pumped into AI, and it's such a big part of just where people are looking to change their business and improve their business. At the end of the day, that's why they're motivated to add it in. But to me, it almost sometimes, and I think there's a danger of there being, you have the solution and now you're looking for the problem, as opposed to having the problem and solving with a solution. So like everyone's saying, okay, like AI, we need to find a way to put it into our business because everyone else is doing it. To your point, like there's a lot of money that goes into just the energy that goes behind to run the systems to keep these the AI going. So the investments for some of these companies, I worry about some of these companies that say, hey, we need to get involved with AI, and it's just not the right time. It's just not the right solution. And I mean, to me, that's the perfect example for where we are right now. And it obviously it's got to play itself out.
I was gonna say, if I may add a very quick addendum to that, and it's not just for AI, but this is again another symptom of system thinking. The system for the last at least 60, 70 years, so let's say post-World War II, capitalist focused systems, is very much we're here to innovate. Innovation trickles down. It obviously improves everybody's lives. That's great. But the moment there's a new technology, a new innovation, a new whatever, everyone needs to jump on it very quickly because no one wants to get left behind. So the knock-on effects of AI, as probably many of you and your listeners are aware of, is the creation of this whole army of data centers, right, that are being built left, right, and center, and they're all being replicated because each major player has to have their own cloud and their own servers and all the rest of it. Recently in Davos, I was listening to one of these change makers who said the data centers, sooner rather than later, are going to be the new American shopping mall. And if you're aware of what's happened to American shopping malls, right, like a lot of them over time are dying. They're, they can't find rent, they can't find stores. The stores are leaving. They'd rather sort of control their own spaces and find their own boutiques. So actually, Amazon is taking over a lot of the empty shopping malls and just turning them into warehouse fulfillment centers. So imagine the amount of time and energy and obviously cost to build these technological feats. And in the end, they're going to be data barren because yes, AI has a place. It can help with productivity. It can help to an extent. Creatives like me, I can use it as a sparring partner, and I can sort of push myself to be a better human creative. But the amount of infrastructure that the system has somehow commanded be built without actually saying, will we actually need this? I'm not even talking 50 years from now, which was the average life cycle of a shopping center. I mean 5 years from now, because technology is expanding at such a rate, at an exponential rate, that 2 years after AI came on the scene, we already started talking about quantum computing. The technology, the hardware needed for that has nothing to do with the data centers being built today. Those will be defunct. And if the point is, again, systematic change, if the system says always jump on the latest tech, and you've spent all this time and all this money in reinforcing the old one because you haven't bothered to pause and say, maybe I should leapfrog what's happening now and start building for something that's 3 iterations down the road, not what's currently down the road, you're going to end up with a lot of, sunk costs, wasted funds. Obviously, the ripple effects this has across, the human element, right? I think a few weeks ago, there was another mass firing at Amazon of 10,000 people, 10,000 real humans, who, again, they'll probably be hired back 6 months later to try and do something else. But it just creates all this commotion for very little end benefit.
Yeah. On the wealth management side, I try to warn clients as to, like NVIDIA, obviously they're at the forefront of this, and, it's one of the first names you think of. But you think of all the technology advances we've seen in you just being 48 years old. Like I remember back to the internet, and AOL was the big thing, right? So with cell phones, BlackBerry, and there's two examples. I mean, we could probably have a whole show on this, the idea of this idea that there's it's got to settle in, right? I think that's kind of what you're saying. And like AOL, for instance, was that what was it, 56K, and they had the crazy sound when you would log in, and now it's moving so fast. Who knows what it's going to look like?
It was so novel that even Hollywood decided to make a movie.
Yeah. So I want to take a step back, like to more of a high level, and talk a little bit about profitability. And I don't want to say a big fan. It's kind of oversimplifying it, but like capitalism, I believe in the strength and the power of capitalism. But I also am I'm realistic, and I feel like maybe smart enough to realize that too much of a good thing becomes disruptive. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing right now, and we're always going to see, is that the strength of capitalism, when does it become too much and when does it become disruptive? I'd love to hear your perspective on, how that you're seeking profitability and growing too quickly can create like blind spots, and what you've found and how you've studied that.
So I need to provide a very small definition, let's say reminder of a definition, right? So profitability in the strictest sense means that after you spend everything you need to spend to bring something to the market, it could be a financial asset, a product, whatever, you make 1 cent more than that cost, and that's your profit, right? If you make at least 1 cent more every time you sell this product service, you are profitable. Profitable at growth or hyperscale growth, these are not about profit. These are about timelines, right? Can you be profitable to a certain level or by a certain multiple in a certain amount of time? So traditional capitalism, again, post World War II, the world was rebuilding itself. It needed capital. It needed capital to flow, and that's how many fortunes were made, and in a responsible and good way. It was just simply, let's build something. Going back to your point before, we find a problem. We build a solution for it. We obviously make sure that we can afford to build the solution and sell it at a marginal profit. So not 1 cent, but $1. And then that dollar obviously goes back into the company. It goes back into shareholders, if we have shareholders, and everyone sort of wins. The problem is when the quote unquote growth system somehow tagged on to capitalism. And that growth, again, with the level of growth and also the timeline for that level to be reached, the manner for it to be manifested. That removed people from responsibility, right? Because all of a sudden the metric wasn't, I need to go from 1% profitability to 2%. It was, I have to go from 1% to 100, and I have to do it by tomorrow. When you put that when you build a system like that, that is essentially a pressure cooker, right? You throw it all in and say, this is what has to happen no matter what. You forget a lot of, again, coming back to companies or even your financial institutions point of view, you forget very quickly, because you're forced to forget the principles that you built your business on, or you built your portfolio on, because speed and velocity and amount of returns, those are the KPIs now. It's not about the journey anymore. It's about the destination. And the destination, there's an urgency to get there as well. It's not, okay, we have a 50-year plan. It's, we have to turn a 50-year plan into a 5-month or a 5-day or a 5-year plan. Principles go out the window. Responsibility goes out the window. And because of this high velocity element to the system, the actors themselves also realize, being human, that they might not even be there at the end of that journey, which again, it reinforces that lack of responsibility, or also lack of interest, right? If you know that a VC has just appointed you as interim CEO to double the business or quadruple the business before it goes to an IPO launch, you say, listen, I'll enter, I'll do what I can. I know I've got 6 months. I've got my golden parachute, and off I go, because anyway, they're just going to plug someone else in right after me. I was recently at an Oliver Wyman conference, which was a CEO panel. And one of the CEOs said, listen, the average tenure of a CEO is 3 to 7 years, 7 if you're lucky. But I need to take decisions today that will impact the CEO 3 versions down the line. That's my model. That's the time scale I'm working for. And because I know that I'm making decisions that will impact that person, 3 CEO generations down the line, it doesn't mean I'm more conservative or I'm less risk averse or any of that. It means I'm taking different kinds of decisions. So I'm not going to launch the latest and greatest supposed innovation, the new nail, just because someone inside the business did an analysis and said it'll deliver an extra 5% profit. I'm not interested in extra 5% profit this year. I'm interested in 5% compounded over the next 30, or 2% compounded over the next 30, which is a far greater return. The problem is there's fewer and fewer people who can survive in the current system with that mentality. That system is obviously also not producing people to think that way. It's cutting them off early. So now when I go, for example, back and I do business mentoring, even at some of my clients, I'm going up against the resistance, which it's not a malicious resistance. It's just that we don't know any better, because we've been trained to think short term, to think for tomorrow, to think about the next quarter, to think about, getting the promotion at the end of the year. So I will pull this business into 50,000 directions because that's what I've been told to do, to validate myself. And these are all competing systems, which, again, at least if they worked with each other harmoniously, right? So the employee was briefed in the same way, the product designer was briefed in the same way, the salesperson, the markets, at least if they all shared the same philosophy and shared the same systematic thinking, fine. But even within, there's so much contrast and so much agitation between them that it ends up compounding into, some of the big explosions that we see. Enron, one of the biggest American utility companies, was pre-booking profit. So they were booking sales 2 years in ahead, and they were saying that they'd processed it this year. They collapsed. They brought down one of the biggest, accountancy firms with them. Why? What was the why did you have to somehow inflate your numbers to book 3 years down the line growth today, rather than say, listen, this year we didn't grow, and that's fine. But guess what? For the next 2 years, we have an amazing pipeline, right? So these are the dynamics that are at play.
Yeah, and as you're talking about this, which makes a ton of sense, and that power, and that sometimes you see somebody do something incredibly wrong that seems like a good person and like a really smart person, but there's a lot of levels to this, right? It's not just like the company, it's the actual person. And I have some personal experience with this, and I just remember thinking at a certain point within my career, there was certain things where it seemed like the company, what we were looking at as the management was kind of in line to what they wanted to get done. But there's also the idea that these employees, they probably a lot of times know what's going on or feel what's going on. You know what I mean? Like, for instance, like that someone's told to do something, just push to sell a widget in a certain way. Let's call it that way. Say, hey, like I need you to go out and sell it in this way, right? And you're like, well, no, that's not right for the company. And so you're forced to wake up and work really, really hard on something that you know is, I want to say wrong, but like you see a better way to do it, right? You're like, no, I've been doing this for 12 years. Like, this is not the right way to sell the widget. Like, we should be focusing. And you say that to the person who's managing you, but they're being told, hey, sell the widget this way. And you tell them, they're like, hey, I don't really care. Like, you need to sell the widget this way. I kind of understand what you're saying, but it doesn't matter. Like, we need to sell. So there's layers of management, and at the personal level, I think, to me, this could be part of the reason why people sometimes are in roles where they just feel they're like, they don't feel like what their hard work, the hard work they're putting forth is actually making a difference, not necessarily just from a profit perspective, but just doing the right thing, right? And I can only imagine, I'm almost certain it happens probably more times than we want to admit. Do you have any experience with that? Just like the employees themselves, and like how that potentially, I mean, is there any feedback there?
So it's a good point. So when I'm brought in usually to work on a project, I call it firefighting, right? So there's again a symptom that the business or the family office or whoever they have, and they say, we see this symptom, can you help us treat it? Inevitably, I don't have to dig very far. There's a much more, again, systemic issue. Now, it could be something that is fundamental to their existence, something quite core, or it could be a core operational issue, which is the elements you're touching on. For those clients where, I sort of am brought in and I see that the company culture, right, the employee culture is one of, feedback isn't really accepted, tolerated, and definitely not asked for. If it is offered by the slightly less hesitant employee or the slightly more naive employee, it's very quickly shut down or quickly ignored or passed over. Unfortunately, I can't say that those kinds of companies cease to exist. There are several of them which are, they're dinosaurs, and they will continue to lumber forward, probably because of their sheer size and economic abilities. But they survive because they have a higher churn. So those employees, especially the ones that are slightly more awake, slightly more conscious, slightly more responsible, they will very quickly say, the way this company or this business does business is not aligned with me. And yes, okay, I know I have to continue earning a salary. I have a mortgage, I have kids, I have whatever. But if the opportunity presents itself for me to jump ship, I will be the first one to go. And that is actually, without turning this into a management discussion, there's something called the Peter Principle, which in short says the least capable people in an organization will rise the fastest, right? Because the good ones, they get fed up, they get angry, they get frustrated, and they leave. They go somewhere else where, again, there's a better alignment with who they are. The very worst performing ones obviously can't afford to move because they don't know if they'll be able to move. So you have that kind of mediocre, and then, and a mix between the mediocre and the low, who the slightly more motivated ones will progress. And then you have a lot of very huge companies, legacy fortune managers, etc., who are a bunch of basically very mediocre people who, they're there because they survived the attrition of everybody else, not because they've had an original thought, they've challenged the system, they've tried to do something positive. And I'm not saying good or evil, just positive. If positive is profit, fine. If positive is growth, fine. But again, under what terms and in what ways and under what timelines?
Yeah. With that said, like I think that I want to take a step in a different direction and talk a little bit about governance. And it's what role it plays in either protecting or undermining, whether it be capitalism or just like the resilience of business.
So for me, again, it's a multi-layered element, right? So you could have a company, you could have a family office, you could have a financial firm, right? You have various layers. You'll have a board, you'll have the executive team that's running things. You might have the principals, or in the case of a family office, the members, right? The different family members who to various degrees are or are not involved. Governance basically comes down to two things. There's the level of interest, but when I say interest, I mean in the pure intent of the entity. Like if I'm an NGO, my intent is to somehow do good in the world. If I'm a financial services firm, my point is somehow to make more money for my investors and my clients. Okay, fine. So what's the level of engagement with that intent? What's the understanding of that intent? And then we come back to what I've said before, the time horizon. Because the best laid plans, the best intents, the best everything, all of that can be very quickly crippled or bastardized if you say you've got 6 months to do it versus you've got 6 hours to do it. Now, if you're trying to save someone in a burning building and you have 6 minutes, you'll break down the building trying to get to them, because the value of that person is better than the bricks and the mortar and the stone. And again, you have a very real timeline which has to be respected. There's no way out. But if you force that kind of timeline, again, from a governance point of view, if you say, you know what, we're going to treat everything that we do within this 6 minute horizon as if we only have 6 minutes, and it's okay to break everything along the way, you'll burn down or break down the first building you have. You'll burn down the second one. How many buildings do you have left to govern after that? Like, you are fundamentally putting cracks in your own foundations. And you'll do it with the employee element and say, that's okay, we'll get new employees tomorrow. You'll do it in the supply chain area and say, we'll swap from Chinese manufacturing to Vietnamese manufacturing. Okay. But you can only fund and survive these swaps for so long. And along the way, again, you have these, if we go back to our AI chatbot discussion, you're creating ripple effects, right? Which will compound on one another and in the end come back to bite you. Whether it's from the customer point of view, from an employee point of view, you might not be able to recruit the right talent anymore because people know to stay away from you. All of these things will come together and they will make your ability to govern far harder. So the level of intent and the time horizon that you try and squeeze that intent through or allow it to flourish, those are the two elements that, whether you're the chairman of the board or you're the employee, and your governance is very much about your one tiny, minute little project that you're supposed to deliver, even if it does nothing for the business from a profit point of view. It's the same two elements.
I mean, I know that I gave you a question that you could probably talk on for or actually write a book about, obviously. So I appreciate you like breaking that down for us. And I think that like a lot of these concepts you're giving us come down to just you've mentioned values and principles a lot throughout this, and we have them regardless of whether we even know what they are. You have 3 principles that you put forward, and I've seen you mention, and I'd love to just really quickly, if it's easy enough for you to explain the 3 that you've put forward to us, which is be of service, not selfish; be sustainable, not short-term focused; and be of significance and not shallow, and how that kind of runs your day to day and where those came from.
Just a very quick piece of background on that. Over the years, as I've been, firefighting various clients' problems, I developed a methodology for doing so. The thing is, that methodology is underpinned by first principles. First principle just being, what are the kernel ideas behind each one of them? When I looked at it from that point of view, I realized that there were kind of these three overarching principles: the be of service, be sustainable, and be of significance. And the reason those came about is because if you take any single one of them, and I'll dive into what they actually mean in a moment, if you take any single one of them, you can be good. If you take all 3 of them together, you can be great. And again, great is up to the eye of the beholder and the definer. But a lot of the time, companies, or not just companies, anyone trying to do anything, they will trip and fall if these 3 principles are not respected. So what are they? The be of service, not be selfish. Again, revealing my age, there was a lovely animated movie that came out in the early 2000s called Robots. So again, very very topical for our day and age.
What was it?
Robots. It had Mel Brooks and Ewan McGregor as the voices, along with several other famous.
Oh yeah, that's right. How old are you? You said that twice already. You said like you're showing your age.
Almost 40.
Oh, come on. Yeah, I'm 48, so like you're not allowed to say that on, on my show. I get it.
Um, so anyway, the main the leader of the robot community, he had his company. There's a saying blazed on it which says, "See a need, fill a need," which is very simply, I see a need of others, right? They have an issue, they have a problem, and I will try and build the right hammer to nail the right nail. Anytime you have a business, especially if you start entering the startup world or the private equity world with small businesses and investors, anytime, at least the way I've seen, that yourself comes first. So yes, you might be curing cancer, but you're curing cancer because you actually want to make $1 billion and buy 5 villas. It's not that you don't deserve the $1 billion. It's not that you don't deserve the 5 villas. But if that's the impetus for you to go out and cure cancer, and if at any point in time you do some kind of evaluation and say, you know what, doing what I'm doing, I'm only going to get 4 villas, so it's not worth me curing cancer. That's the split in the road. That's the fork. You have to be other person focused, which again is not natural. Like in nature, the system of nature is very much, every individual animal has to take care of itself first and foremost. But if we're supposed to be the evolved species, part of that evolution is taking care of someone else first, right? That's principle one. Principle two, be sustainable, not short term. I use the word sustainable in its purest form, as in something that makes sure that it's regenerative, that it takes care of itself. It makes sure that it survives tomorrow. There obviously, the ESG point of view, from a climate point of view, from an energy point of view, all of that those are elements of it. But at its base, it's just about, I will worry about tomorrow, not just today. And again, it goes back to what I've said before, right? If you can have the best intentions, the intent, right? That's the be of service to others. If you squeeze that into that 6 minute or 6 day or 6 month time horizon, that's not sustainable, because you are going to force cracks in the system, which you could otherwise very clearly avoid, and probably build better systems to override them. And the last principle, the be of significance, it's kind of the stretch target. Think of it that way, right? So you can help others, you can do it in the right way over the right time, the right time period, so you make sure you can continue to help them. But if you are going to help someone, we're not talking about. It's always nice to help someone cross the road, but if the road itself is broken, I'd rather fix the whole road so I could help many more people. Again, in very real ways. So it's not the kind of new age social media, I need to have 1 million TikTok followers, and every time I post something, it needs to go viral. But 7 seconds later, the client has swiped to the next, influencer. I'd rather impact the lives of 10 people and fundamentally change their lives than try to grab the attention of 1 million. And again, 7 seconds later, they don't even remember who I am. So it's, again, that stretch target to say, listen, if you're going to go through this whole process of building something to change someone's life, to improve someone's life, and by extension your own, and you're going to do it in a way that is sustainable, that is long-term focused, that can maintain itself, obviously the end deliverable of that should mean something to someone. Now, you might pick a problem to solve that, again, it only will solve the lives of 10 people. Again, going back to the pharmaceutical world, there are several diseases, dozens of diseases, in fact, which can be cured, but pharmaceutical companies don't, because the level of investment that's required doesn't warrant the 100 people on the planet it's going to help. You could say, well, they're focusing their resources to help 100 million other clients, but they already have those resources and they already have those revenue streams. If, again, going back to principles, if, as they state on their lovely, beautiful websites, they're here to save humanity and improve humanity, then if you have the resources and the time and the intelligence and the human capital available to you, you will also help these pockets of 100 people here, 100 people there, even if it's not profitable per se. So those are the three principles. As I said, they're there to get anyone from good to great. You can skip 2 out of 3, you can skip 3 out of 3, and then you get your Enrons and your WeWorks and all the rest of it. But these sort of underpin my thinking. They underpin, I think, kind of the new kinds of systems that some people, both in business and in finance and in humanitarian sectors, they're trying to put forward.
As you're talking, I'm picturing this Venn diagram.
Yeah, where they converge.
Whenever I figured out, I was like, and they overlap, and greatness is in the center. And I like the idea of. I'm also thinking of Meatloaf. I don't know if they're for Meatloaf fans. Like 2 out of 3 ain't bad, but it's probably not gonna work here. That's great. Thank you for sharing there. So that's all. This is a great conversation. I mean, that's all the questions I have for you today. Really, thank you for sharing your expertise and your experience and your book. And it sounds like, you have another one coming out, but we have everyone check out Built to Collapse, which I understand is a fiction based off of real concepts. And personally, I look forward to checking it out myself. But it sounds like you have a new book coming out. Maybe really quickly you could tell us about that. That will be nonfiction, I believe, right?
Yeah. So again, very quick journey I went on. I started off trying to create like a 5-page ebook for startups because I kept having all these mentoring sessions, realizing they weren't speaking to me at the same level. So I just wanted to give them something very quick and rough to sort of build their capabilities, and then we could have a more like-minded business to business discussion. The 5-page ebook turned into a 500-page manual, mostly because that process I mentioned before, which is actually called Pathfinder, which is 10 steps. Every time I was dissecting the step, I had to bring it back to these 3 principles and demonstrate how each of these 3 principles plays out along that process. And that just added and added and added and created this behemoth of a text, which gets quite heavy. So I extracted the principles, I put them into this business fiction Built to Collapse, which follows the life of a VC fixer. So he's been hired by a VC to fix certain companies in their portfolio and make them profitable again. And as he meets the different businesses that are in the portfolio and the business owners or the business teams, he understands that the system that he's been refining for or fixing for isn't probably the system he wants to continue supporting and being in. Now, book 2 is the continuation of that to say, listen, if you understand these principles, you agree with these principles, and you'd like to take them further, here's the non-fiction way to do so. Here are the 10 steps. There's case studies. There's very good examples. There's also work exercises. And the point is, you can use this book to build a business, but more fundamentally, you can use this book to understand who you are, understand what you can offer to the world. And you can be an independent business owner, you can be an employee, you can be a family office manager. It doesn't matter. What can you do for the world? What problems are you open to solving and capable of solving? And then lastly, how do you then communicate that and connect with the various audiences, right? So how do you find those initial 10 people whose lives you're going to disproportionately impact? And by doing so, you will find the next 1,000 and the next million, but in a quantified and qualified way, not because, you danced on TikTok or did the ice bucket challenge.
Excellent. We look forward to that. Before we go, maybe you could share with our listeners how they can get in touch with you, connect with you, whether it be social media or just the best way to reach out to you, and more importantly, maybe get a copy of your book or books here soon. And when's the new book coming out?
In May.
In May.
So easiest way is just me.com, so eugenetheodore.com. You'll find all the information you need on what I do, how I do it, the books, links. Obviously very happy to continue this conversation with anyone that it sparked some ideas with, or just have a happy repartee.
Great. We'll include all that information in the show resources, of course. Thanks again, Eugene. It was great to have you. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in to today's episode.
Don't forget to follow the Agent of Wealth on the platform you listen from and leave us a review of the show. We're currently accepting new clients, and if you'd like to schedule a one-on-one consultation with our advisors, please do so at bautisfinancial.com/call.
Thank you for listening to the Agent of Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Bautis Financial. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional financial planning and investment advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investments and financial planning.